I had been hiking for what felt like days, my legs aching with every step as I pushed myself along the Appalachian Trail. The days were long and the nights even longer, but there was something about the rhythm of the hike that kept me going. The steady crunch of my boots on the dirt trail, the sound of birds chirping in the trees, and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was all so peaceful. I had been alone for the most part, aside from the occasional passerby, but this stretch of the trail felt especially quiet. I had planned on camping for the night in a secluded spot near a stream, but as the sun began to set, I noticed something strange off to the side of the trail. A small clearing with an abandoned campsite. The fire pit was still warm, the faint smell of burned wood lingering in the air. A half-pitched tent stood awkwardly, as if it had been abandoned in a rush. I slowed my pace, eyeing the scene carefully. There were food wrappers scattered around the ground, a half-open bag of chips, a plastic bottle of water lying next to it. It was odd. Whoever had been here, they hadn't packed up properly. They'd left in a hurry, but there was no sign of anyone around. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. It wasn't uncommon to come across an abandoned campsite, but this one felt different. Something about it made me uneasy, a sense of wrongness I couldn't quite put my finger on. But after a moment, I shrugged it off. I had miles to go before I could stop for the night, and there wasn't much sense in letting something so small distract me. Besides, I needed a place to rest. I set up my own camp a short distance away, near the stream, making sure to keep my distance from the abandoned site. As the evening wore on, I felt the cold creeping in, the sun dipping lower and lower behind the trees. I built a small fire, just enough to ward off the chill, and unpacked my gear, preparing for a night under the stars. The quiet of the forest wrapped around me, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax. It was just after dark when I first heard it. A heavy, deliberate footstep, then another. I paused, my body tensing instinctively. The sound came from behind me, somewhere in the woods, not far from my camp. My heart rate quickened. I listened intently, straining to hear over the crackling of the fire. The steps were slow but purposeful, like someone was moving carefully through the underbrush. I thought for a moment that it might just be an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but there was something about the sound that didn't sit right. It wasn't the soft pad of paws, it was the crunch of boots on the forest floor. Human footsteps. I turned my head, scanning the darkening trees around me. Nothing. The forest was still. The firelight flickered, casting long, strange shadows that danced across the trees. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Couldn't ignore it. The footsteps were getting closer, circling my camp. I could hear them clearly now, heavy steps, methodical, like someone was walking around the perimeter of my campsite, just out of sight. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack and shined it around the trees, half expecting to see someone standing just out of reach of the light. But again, there was nothing, only shadows and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I was about to turn back when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Near the fire pit, just beyond the reach of the light, stood a figure. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, but a person. A man. He was standing still, watching me. I could make out the shape of him, his body half hidden in the darkness, but his eyes reflected the light from the fire. I couldn't see his face clearly, but those eyes were locked on mine, unmoving. Panic surged through me, my breath catching in my throat. I froze, unable to look away, unable to move. The figure didn't make a sound, just stood there, his gaze unwavering. It was as if he was waiting for something, or maybe he was simply watching me. I had no idea who he was or why he was there. I didn't even know if he had been the one circling my camp, or if there was someone else. But in that moment, everything in my mind screamed at me to get out of there. I couldn't stay here, not with that man standing in the dark, staring at me. I grabbed my pack, not bothering to zip it up. I didn't even care about the fire. My heart was pounding in my chest as I quickly shoved everything into my bag, struggling to pull my tent down in the panic. The sound of the man's footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed in my mind as I fumbled with my gear. He hadn't moved, but I knew he was still watching me. I could feel it. I didn't take the time to think, didn't take the time to second-guess myself. I bolted. I didn't even check to see if the man was following me. I just ran, my pack bouncing against my back, the forest blurring around me in the darkness. The trail was rough, branches and roots tripping me up, but I didn't care. I kept running, not daring to look behind me. Every breath burned in my chest, and my legs screamed in pain, but I didn't stop. I ran through the forest for what felt like hours, the sound of my footsteps pounding in my ears, the only company the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. My mind was a blur of fear, adrenaline, and the image of those eyes staring at me from the darkness. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of the ranger station through the trees. I stumbled out of the woods, breathless and shaking, nearly collapsing on the steps of the ranger station. The lights from the building cut through the night, and I rushed up to the door, banging on it frantically. The rangers inside opened the door, looking startled but quickly taking in my disheveled appearance. I could barely get the words out, just a jumble of fear and adrenaline, trying to explain what had happened. One of the rangers stepped outside with me, looking back into the woods as if expecting someone to come out of the shadows. But the forest was silent. No footsteps, no figure, just the quiet of the night. "Are you sure you saw someone?" the ranger asked, his voice calm but with an edge of concern. I nodded, my chest still heaving with the aftereffects of the sprint. I saw him. He was standing near my camp, watching me. The ranger didn't say anything right away, but I could tell he was considering it. He looked out into the woods again, scanning the area. "You're safe now. Don't worry about it." But I wasn't sure I would ever feel safe again. Something about that night, about that figure in the woods, felt off in a way I couldn't explain. The rangers eventually gave me a place to sleep for the night, and they offered to help me report the incident, but I declined. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I just wanted to forget. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see those eyes staring at me from the darkness. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the slow, deliberate footsteps that circled my camp. Whoever that man was, he wasn't just out for a walk in the woods. He had been watching me, and I still don't know why. Maybe he was looking for someone else, or maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Either way, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The next morning, I packed up my gear and left the ranger station as soon as I could. I didn't say goodbye, didn't look back. I just kept walking farther and farther from that campsite, from that figure in the woods. I'll never forget that night. The man in the woods, the footsteps, the eyes. It was something I wouldn't wish on anyone. And every time I step onto a trail now, every time I set up camp in the wilderness, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I can't shake the feeling that someone or something is out there, waiting in the dark. I had been looking forward to this solo camping trip for weeks. The high desert of Arizona had always intrigued me. Its stark, raw beauty and isolation seemed like the perfect escape from the grind of everyday life. I wanted to disconnect, clear my head, and just exist for a few days without the distractions of civilization. So, I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and set out to find a spot far from anyone. The drive was long and quiet, just the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind against the desert brush. I passed a few scattered towns, each one smaller and more desolate than the last, until eventually the pavement turned into a dirt road, the kind that only locals knew about. I didn't mind. I'd read enough about the area to know what to expect. Dry, barren, and empty, with the occasional cactus or scrub bush to break up the landscape. By the time I found a decent camping spot, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, slanting shadows over the desert floor. It wasn't much, just a flat patch of ground surrounded by low shrubs and a few scattered rocks. But it was perfect for what I needed. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. The air was still warm, but it was starting to cool, and the fire felt good against the dry desert chill. I spent the evening cooking up some simple food, savoring the quiet. The only sound was the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant call of a coyote. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. The kind of quiet that wraps around you like a blanket, heavy and thick. As the last light of day faded, the night truly began to settle in. The fire flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and sway with a life of their own. The stars above were so bright, they almost hurt to look at, scattered across the sky like diamonds spilled from a velvet bag. But despite the beauty, a strange feeling started to settle in the pit of my stomach. I wasn't used to being this alone. Sure, I'd spent time in the wilderness before, but never like this. Far away from any trail, any other campers, and even the faint hum of traffic. The vastness of it all was a little overwhelming. The desert was alive, but in a way that felt wrong, silent and ancient. And now, in the dim light of the fire, I noticed something. There, just at the edge of the fire's glow, were two eyes. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote or a fox, curious about the fire. But these eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They just stared at me, unblinking, unfeeling. Something about them felt wrong, too still, too deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the shadows were playing tricks on me. But as the minutes passed, the eyes didn't shift, didn't leave. They were locked on me, and I felt a growing sense of unease. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. I was drawn to them. My mind screamed at me to look somewhere else, to get up, to do something, but my body refused to obey. It was as if the eyes had me in a trance, holding me there in the light of the fire. I wanted to call out, to shout, but no words came. The only thing I could do was sit there, my chest tight, my breath shallow. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. My eyes never left the pair of glowing orbs in the darkness. They still didn't move. Then, finally, I forced myself to look away. I grabbed a stick from the fire and poked at the embers, anything to break the tension. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever those eyes belonged to, it was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I turned my head, slowly scanning the dark edges of the camp, trying to see if there was any sign of movement. Nothing. The desert was still, silent, and empty. I thought about calling out, but the thought of drawing attention to myself made my skin crawl. What if whatever was watching me didn't want to be disturbed? The wind picked up slightly, rustling the dry brush around me, but other than that, it was deathly quiet. I kept glancing back toward the spot where the eyes had been, but there was nothing there anymore. The darkness had swallowed everything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After a while, I stood up, stretched my legs, and walked around the camp, trying to convince myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But every step felt too loud, too forced. I kept my gaze locked on the edges of the firelight, watching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The night felt heavy, oppressive, as if the desert was pressing down on me. I checked the tent, made sure everything was secure. I hadn't brought a lot of gear with me, just the essentials, so I didn't feel like I had to worry about anything. But that feeling, the one that had started when I first saw those eyes, hadn't gone away. In fact, it had only intensified. The desert felt like it was closing in on me. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that I had been alone for too long, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I sat by the fire for a while longer, listening to the wind, staring into the flames. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the warmth and comfort of the fire, the sense of unease lingered. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay down. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, faint rustles in the brush, the snap of a twig. But every time I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, there was nothing there. Just the empty desert, the silence, and the stars. By the time morning came, I had barely slept. I was exhausted, but I had to get up, break camp, and get out of there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that had been watching me all night. But when I emerged from the tent and looked around, The desert was still and quiet, just like it had been the day before. There were no signs of anything unusual, no tracks, no disturbances in the sand. I packed up quickly, eager to leave. As I gathered my things, I glanced around one last time, scanning the area. That's when I saw them, footprints, fresh ones, leading right up to my tent. My heart dropped into my stomach. They were large, deep prints, almost like someone had been walking around my camp. Whoever or whatever had been watching me had been much closer than I thought. I stood there for a moment, staring at the prints, my mind racing. The footprints didn't belong to any animal I knew. They weren't the tracks of a coyote or a bobcat or anything like that. They were human-sized and they seemed deliberate. There was no sign of anyone around now, but those prints made my blood run cold. I followed the tracks for a few steps, but they disappeared into the desert, lost in the endless expanse of sand and rock. There was no sign of anyone, no trace of what had made them. It was like the person or thing had just vanished. I didn't waste any more time. I packed up my camp faster than I'd ever done before and got in my truck, my hands shaking as I started the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes, staring at me from the dark. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, just the desert playing its usual games with a lonely camper. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had been watched, followed, maybe even stalked. And whatever had been out there, I didn't want to know any more about it. The desert is a place of beauty, yes, but it's also a place where you can vanish without a trace. And as I drove away, I realized I had been close to becoming just another lost soul in the vast, empty expanse of the Arizona desert. It was the kind of night that made you forget the world outside the mountains. The Colorado wilderness surrounded us, deep in a remote campsite we'd been to several times before. The stars above were hidden behind a veil of trees, the forest thick and dense around us. The air smelled fresh, earthy, with a faint scent of pine, like we were tucked away in the heart of nature, far from any city or road. The fire crackled, sending occasional bursts of warmth into the night, and the scent of burning would fill the cool air. It was a good fire, one of those campfires that made everything feel safe and comfortable. We were a group of 5, gathered around, the familiar faces of old friends illuminated by the dancing flames. We talked, we laughed, we joked about nothing in particular, our voices bouncing off the trees, filling the night with sound. Everything felt normal. The fire had been going for hours by the time it started to flicker lower, the flames shrinking to embers that hissed softly as they died. The heat from the fire felt good on my skin, but the chill of the mountain air was creeping in, urging me to pull my jacket tighter. It was one of those perfect nights where everything felt calm, serene, until something shifted. I was staring into the fire, thinking about the day we'd had, hiking up the ridge, laughing at each other's tiredness, when something caught my eye at the edge of the circle of light. It was a figure, tall and dark, standing just outside the fire's reach. For a split second, I thought it was one of my friends, maybe trying to play some kind of joke on us. But no one had moved. We were all in front of the fire, settled into our seats, comfortable, familiar. It wasn't one of them. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The smoke from the fire swirled and thinned in the cold night air, blurring my vision, but I could still make out the shape of the figure. It was standing perfectly still, like it was waiting for something. Its edges were blurry, shifting in the smoke, but it was tall, much taller than any of us. I felt a sudden unease crawl up my spine. It didn't move, not even a twitch. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe the shadows were messing with my eyes, bending the light, but that didn't feel right. My friends continued talking and laughing, oblivious to whatever I was seeing. I glanced at them, then back to the figure. Still nothing, no movement. My stomach turned. I stood up slowly, trying not to alert anyone. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. The longer I stared at the figure, the more I began to realize it wasn't human. It wasn't shaped like a person, at least not fully. It didn't have the usual proportions, the typical outline of someone standing in the woods. It was all wrong. Took a step. One slow, deliberate movement. My heart skipped a beat. I should have said something, should have called out to the others, but I was frozen, caught in that moment where my brain couldn't quite register what I was seeing. The figure's shape moved just enough for me to know it was real, too real, and then it vanished into the trees. Gone. I blinked, thinking it was some kind of optical illusion, but when I looked again, there was nothing, just the blackness of the forest beyond the firelight, and the sound of wind rustling through the branches. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath stuck in my throat, my mind racing. Was it an animal? A bear or something larger? No, it was too tall, too unnaturally tall. And its movement, slow and calculated, didn't match anything I'd ever seen from an animal, not even a predator. My stomach felt heavy, like something was weighing me down. I slowly sank back into my seat, trying to look casual, trying to act like nothing was wrong. But the panic bubbling inside me wasn't so easy to ignore. I could still feel my eyes searching the darkness, my senses on high alert, scanning for anything out of place. But all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind. "Everything okay?" one of my friends asked, noticing I was no longer laughing with them. "Yeah, fine," I muttered, not quite believing my own words. They didn't seem to notice anything odd, didn't see what I had seen. The night continued, as if nothing had changed, but inside I was struggling to stay calm. The fire continued to burn, the warmth of the flames fighting against the cold mountain air. I tried to distract myself by joining in the conversation, but the weight in my chest only grew heavier. My mind kept returning to that figure, that tall, dark silhouette. I told myself it was just an animal, some wild creature I didn't recognize. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had seen things in the wild before. Bears, wolves, even a mountain lion once, but this felt different. This was something wrong. It wasn't long before we all decided to call it a night. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing embers, and the temperature had dropped further, the chill of the mountain night sinking deep into our bones. We all crawled into our tents, each of us settling into our sleeping bags. But sleep didn't come easy for me. I kept hearing things in the dark. The rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs, the occasional howl of a distant coyote. It was all normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, just my mind playing tricks after a long day in the mountains. But every noise, every creak of the tent fabric, sent a jolt of panic through me. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the night, the sounds of the forest keeping me on edge. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, sending the branches swaying and creaking. I wanted to go outside, to check the area, but the thought of stepping into that dark, empty forest, after what I'd seen, kept me rooted to the spot. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure, the way it had moved so silently, almost purposefully. I kept thinking about the way it had stepped out of the firelight, only to vanish into the woods as if it had never been there at all. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how impossible it was that I had been the only one to see it. Morning came, but it didn't bring any comfort. The sun rose weakly through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch too far. I woke up to the sound of my friends stirring, packing up their gear, but the weight of the night's events lingered. We packed up camp quickly, eager to get on the move, to leave the unsettling emptiness of the campsite behind. As we hiked out of the woods, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. But there was nothing. No sign of it, no trace of anything unusual. It was as if the entire night had been a dream, a trick of the mind. But I knew better. I didn't say anything to my friends. They were all too busy chatting and laughing, already back to their usual selves. And for a moment, I almost convinced myself that maybe it had been a trick of the firelight or my imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Something had been out there, something that didn't belong. We never went back to that campsite. No one ever mentioned it again. But I knew what I had felt, what I had seen. It was a feeling that stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts every time I stepped into the woods. And whenever I sit around a campfire now, my eyes always drift to the shadows at the edge of the light, just to make sure nothing is standing there, watching. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the vast Wyoming backcountry wrapped in a thick blanket of darkness. It was the kind of night that felt eerily still, with no wind, no animals, not even the hum of insects. I had made camp earlier in the evening, setting up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by dense brush and tall pines. The night was cool, but not cold enough to make me uncomfortable, and I was grateful for the solitude. I'd been hiking all day, and the exhaustion of my muscles made me ready for a deep sleep. The quiet of the wilderness was so complete, it felt as if the entire world had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the distant sound of a creek, the soft rustle of leaves from the trees above. For a while, I just stared at the ceiling of my tent, watching the shadows of the branches move slightly with the breeze that stirred above. My thoughts drifted between the day's hike and the beauty of this place. But as the minutes passed, something began to gnaw at me, a sensation that I couldn't shake. A strange unease prickled the back of my neck, and my muscles tensed as if I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, that the wilderness could make anyone feel that way, but the feeling lingered. I turned over in my bag, trying to find a comfortable position. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling, just outside my tent. It was subtle at first, almost like the sound of a squirrel or something small moving through the brush. But then it grew louder, heavier. The unmistakable crunch of something larger, something much heavier, moving deliberately through the underbrush. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal I recognized, no deer, no small rodent. This was something big, something that was circling my campsite. I remained still, listening. The sound came closer, moving along the edge of my tent, pausing for a moment before continuing. It was as if whatever it was looking for something. I felt a cold sweat begin to form on my forehead. I told myself it was probably just a bear, maybe a mountain lion, but I knew deep down that it didn't feel like an animal. This was different. I reached for the flashlight tucked into the corner of my tent and grabbed it with shaking hands. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but the curiosity and fear pressing down on me were stronger than my hesitation. I unzipped the tent quietly, trying not to make a sound. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dark, scanning the clearing around me. My heart hammered in my chest as the light swept across the campsite. There was nothing, no sign of any animal. The bushes were still, the trees unmoving, the ground untouched. Confused and on edge, I stood up slowly, gripping the flashlight tightly in my hand. My breath was coming fast now, my eyes darting from one side of the campsite to the other. I didn't want to believe it, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I felt like something was right behind me, just out of sight. My skin crawled, and my muscles tensed in anticipation of the worst. I turned around to look behind me. Nothing. It was then that I felt it. A breath, cold and steady, like a gust of wind that never came. It was on the back of my neck. A shiver ran down my spine as my body went rigid. It wasn't the kind of cold air you feel when the temperature drops. It was different. It felt as if someone was standing there, just inches away, breathing down my neck. I could almost hear the whisper of the wind, but it wasn't the wind. A faint whisper, just behind me, almost inaudible, said, "You're not alone." I spun around, the flashlight's beam flicking across the trees, the brush, the rocks. There was nothing, just empty space. No person, no animal, not a single soul. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, rapid gasps. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as if something unseen was standing there, just out of reach. I searched the darkness with frantic eyes, but everything was still, too still. I wanted to bolt, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot by fear. I stared into the darkness, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had been alone all day, had made no noise, and there was no one out here for miles. The nearest town was hours away, and I was deep in the backcountry. Who could have whispered? Why had they been circling my campsite? I stood there for what felt like hours, but when I finally forced myself to move, I didn't feel the safety of my tent anymore. The campfire from earlier had long since died down, and the night seemed colder, more threatening now. I couldn't go back to sleep. I couldn't even close my eyes. I stayed up for the rest of the night, listening intently for any sign of movement, any sound in the quiet. My flashlight flickered out twice, and each time I had to fight the panic rising in my chest as I replaced the batteries. I told myself it was just the wilderness, the animals, the wind playing tricks on me. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing but the normal noises of the forest, but my instincts told me otherwise. I kept hearing the sounds, too, faint and distant, but they were there. It was like something was pacing just outside the reach of the light, waiting, watching. I would hear a crack of a branch, a snap of a twig, followed by a heavy silence. Then the circling would start again, moving around my tent. But every time I tried to look, there was nothing. It was as if whatever it was didn't want to be seen. At some point, the whispers stopped, but the feeling of being followed, of being observed, never left. I kept my back pressed against the inside of the tent, clutching my flashlight as though it might ward off whatever was out there. The tension in my body was unbearable. I couldn't help but wonder, was I being stalked? By what? A bear? A mountain lion? Or something more sinister? The hours dragged on. I had no idea what time it was, but when the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the sounds stopped. The quiet returned, and with it, the uneasy sense that I had survived something I couldn't explain. As the sun rose, I cautiously peeked out of my tent, scanning the clearing. It was empty still. The wilderness had returned to its usual quiet. I didn't waste time breaking camp. My hands were shaking as I packed up my gear, but I forced myself to focus on getting out. I didn't look back. The wilderness was beautiful, but it felt different now, as if it were hiding something I wasn't meant to understand. When I finally made my way back to the trailhead, my heart was still racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, even though I could see no sign of it. There was no animal tracks, no disturbance in the earth, nothing out of place. But I knew, deep down, that something had been out there with me. Something had been watching, and whatever it wasn't natural. I've never gone camping in Wyoming again. The memories of that night, the feeling of being watched, the whisper in the dark, they still haunt me. I've camped in other places, but the backcountry of Wyoming will always be a place I avoid. The wilderness is beautiful, but it can also be a place where things hide in the shadows, waiting. You never know what's out there, and sometimes it's better not to find out. We had been planning this trip for months. A small group of friends, 4 of us in total, decided to take a long weekend and head out into the Smoky Mountains for a camping trip. It wasn't too far from home, but far enough that we knew we wouldn't run into any other campers. We wanted peace, seclusion, and a break from the usual noise of the world. So, after some back-and-forth discussions on which trail to take, we settled on a quiet, remote section of the Smoky Mountains, one of the more isolated areas. We set out early in the morning, the sun barely poking through the trees as we loaded our backpacks into the car and drove for a couple of hours. By noon, we had reached the trailhead. The first day was everything we had hoped for. The sun was shining, and the air was cool and crisp. The forest around us was dense, but it had that calming effect of being surrounded by nature. We hiked for about 6 miles that day, and by the time we set up camp, it felt like we were a world away from everything else. The campsite was nestled in a small clearing with a stream nearby, the sound of running water adding to the tranquility of the place. We set up our tents, built a small fire, and spent the evening cooking dinner and chatting. There were no other campers in sight, no signs of any other human presence for miles. The isolation was exactly what we needed. As night settled in, we sat around the fire, the crackling of the flames the only noise besides the occasional rustle of the trees in the wind. The stars above were clear and bright, casting an eerie but beautiful glow on the forest. We were all tired from the hike, so we turned in early. It felt like the perfect camping trip. But that night, something happened that would change everything. I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, almost like a soft, distant cry. I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind, or maybe an animal in the distance. But the longer I lay there, the more distinct the sound became. It was a child crying out for help. First, I tried to brush it off. It wasn't uncommon for animals to make noises that resembled a human cry, or for someone to be camping nearby and their kids getting upset. But the sound grew louder, and my instincts began to stir. This wasn't right. I sat up in my tent, listening intently. The cry was far away but clear, and it sent a chill down my spine. The sound of a child calling out for help in the middle of nowhere was not something that could easily be ignored. I glanced over at my friends, all of them still sleeping, unaware of the unsettling noise that had roused me. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should wake them. It wasn't like we had any other campers nearby. After a moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we needed to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped my tent. My breath puffed out in the cold air as I stepped outside, trying not to disturb the others. The cry sounded again, a faint wail carried by the wind. It was coming from the woods to the west of our campsite, deep within the trees. My first thought was that it could be a lost child, maybe a camper from another group who had wandered off. I walked over to the fire where I had left my backpack, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it across the campsite to see if anyone else was awake. I saw Steve stirring in his tent. I went over and nudged him, whispering to him about the sound. He woke up groggily and agreed that we should check it out. We didn't want to leave anyone behind, so we woke the others too, Sarah and Mike, and quickly discussed what we should do. Everyone was on edge, but none of us felt brave enough to stay alone. We grabbed our flashlights and started walking in the direction of the cries, making sure to stay close together. The woods around us were dense, and the path we had followed earlier that day had already become hard to make out in the dark. We walked deeper into the forest, following the sound. The cry became louder with each step, but no matter how far we walked, the source of the sound never seemed to get any closer. It felt like we were walking in circles, always hearing it from the same distance away. We pushed on, our footsteps crunching on the forest floor. The sound of the child's cry was unnerving, but we couldn't bring ourselves to turn back. We assumed we'd find a camper who had lost their way, or maybe a kid who had wandered off in the dark. But after an hour of walking, the sound stopped. Just like that, fell into complete silence. The forest felt different now, like it was watching us. We stood there for a moment, listening to the deafening quiet. The wind had died down, and the only noise was the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered, breaking the silence. We all looked around, unsure of where to go next. The forest was dark, and the trees towered above us, blocking out the little light that had been left by the moon. We had walked so far, and yet we couldn't even see where we were. The sound of the cry had stopped, but the feeling of being lost was sinking in. We had no idea where we were, and the sense of dread that had begun creeping up on us was impossible to ignore. Sarah, always the pragmatic one, suggested we turn back. The longer we stood there, the more disoriented we felt. We had no idea if we were heading in the right direction. The fear was setting in now, and we all knew that getting lost in the wilderness at night was no joke. We decided to head back to camp, but as we turned around and retraced our steps, things didn't seem right. We couldn't remember the way back. The trees looked unfamiliar. The path we had followed earlier no longer existed. The more we walked, the more it seemed like we were going deeper into the forest, not back toward camp. We began to panic. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, and the others were equally uneasy. The feeling of being lost grew stronger with each passing minute. Our flashlights flickered, and the cold began to seep into my bones. The air was thick, like the forest was closing in around us. We stopped, standing in a small clearing, trying to figure out what to do. No one said anything for a few moments. We were all thinking the same thing. We were completely lost, and the eerie cry of the child that had led us into the woods was now nothing more than a memory, replaced by the oppressive silence of the forest. "Should we split up?" Steve asked, his voice tense. "No," I said quickly. "That would be even worse. Let's stay together." We began walking again, but it felt like we were walking in circles. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the night felt colder and darker than it had before. We were all terrified now, each of us knowing that getting lost in the woods in the dark was one of the worst situations you could be in. I couldn't help but wonder if we had somehow wandered into a section of the woods where the terrain was unfamiliar, or if our sense of direction was off because of the anxiety. But there was something else, something that kept making my skin crawl. The woods around us were eerily still. It wasn't just the lack of sound from the animals. It was like everything had stopped moving. The trees, the wind, everything was motionless. We finally made the decision to stop and try to get our bearings. We had been walking for what felt like hours, and our flashlights were starting to dim. We had no idea where we were or which direction we needed to go. Panic started to take hold. We all knew that if we didn't find our way back soon, we were in serious trouble. We sat down in a small clearing, trying to think straight, but the cold was creeping into our bones, and every sound seemed to put us on edge. I kept listening for that crying, but it never came. After what seemed like an eternity, we finally stumbled across a familiar landmark, an old, weathered tree that we had passed earlier in the day. We were relieved to recognize it, but we also knew that we still had a long way to go before we could reach the safety of our camp. With renewed determination, we followed the direction we believed would lead us back to camp. The path was rough, but after what felt like hours of walking, we finally saw the faint light of our campfire in the distance. We rushed toward it, stumbling through the trees, and when we finally emerged into the clearing, we all let out a collective sigh of relief. We were back. We had made it, but no one slept that night. The fire was still burning, and we huddled around it, too shaken to relax. We packed up our things at dawn, the first light of morning breaking through the trees, and we left without a word. The road back to civilization felt like the longest drive of our lives, but we didn't care. We were just happy to leave the woods behind. None of us ever spoke of the cry we heard again, but we all knew that we had come too close to something we didn't understand. That night in the Smoky Mountains will always haunt me, and I've never been camping there again. We had been planning this trip for weeks. My friend Jason and I, both nature lovers and outdoor enthusiasts, had always talked about hiking through the desolate, rugged terrain of New Mexico, specifically the vast stretches of Navajo land. It wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot, which made it all the more appealing. No crowds, no distractions, just the raw beauty of the desert and wilderness. We were excited, maybe too excited for what we thought would be an unforgettable adventure. But we didn't know just how unforgettable it would turn out to be. We arrived at the campsite after a long day of driving and hiking, the sun beginning to dip low over the horizon, casting the world in a golden glow. The air had started to cool, and the smells of sagebrush and dust filled the atmosphere. It felt peaceful, even though we were deep in unfamiliar land. The wide-open desert stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional rugged rock formation or distant buttes. I felt like we were miles away from civilization, and for once, it was exactly what I needed. After setting up our tent, we decided to cook over a fire, nothing fancy, just some dehydrated meals. Jason had brought along a small portable stove, but we opted for the old-fashioned way, gathering firewood and lighting a flame the good, primitive way. As the fire crackled and the shadows of the desert night settled in around us, I felt a deep sense of calm. The kind of calm you only get when you're far from city noise and surrounded by nature. The night was dark, except for the firelight that threw flickering shadows against the rocks and surrounding brush. The stars were out in full force, brighter than I had ever seen them. It felt like the sky stretched on forever, untouched and pure. We sat back, enjoying the peace, talking about everything and nothing, the sounds of the night acting as a backdrop to our conversation. It must have been just past midnight when I noticed the first strange thing. The fire had burned down to a low, steady glow, and the night had taken on an almost unnatural stillness. There were no crickets chirping, no wind rustling the brush, just complete silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. It made my skin crawl a little, but I didn't say anything to Jason. I figured he'd think I was being paranoid, so I kept it to myself. But then there was a sound, a soft rustling in the brush, coming from the woods that lay just beyond the light of our fire. It wasn't an animal, not a normal noise you'd expect from a creature of the desert. It was too deliberate, too calculated. Jason and I both stopped talking, and our eyes darted toward the dark woods, trying to make sense of the movement. For a second, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a bear or something else, moving through the underbrush. But then the sound grew closer. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. It was something else, something that didn't belong. The figure that emerged from the trees was not a bear, as we had first assumed. It was taller than a bear, but it was walking low, its body almost hunched, like it was trying to move quietly through the brush. My heart started to beat faster as I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was just some kind of wild animal, but it didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. The figure didn't seem to care about being stealthy anymore. It walked slowly into the light of our fire, and I could finally make out its shape in detail. It was humanoid, but something was wrong with it. Its limbs were longer than any humans should be, and the body itself seemed too thin, too elongated. It had a strange, unnatural gait, almost like it was dragging its lower half, like its legs weren't meant to bend that way. It moved with an eerie precision, each step deliberate, as though it was aware we were watching. Jason and I froze, our eyes wide, our bodies stiff with fear. The figure's face was obscured at first, hidden in the shadows, but then it stepped into the firelight fully. That's when I saw its eyes, glowing red, like the embers of the fire, but brighter, more intense. I couldn't look away from them. They were fixed on us, unblinking, as though it was studying us, calculating something. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and for the first time in my life, I felt true primal fear. The creature stopped just outside the firelight, its body still hunched, but its head tilted slightly, as if it was trying to understand what we were. I couldn't bring myself to move, couldn't even speak. Jason didn't say anything either. We just stared at it, too scared to break the silence. Then it let out a sound, not a growl, but something deeper, more guttural, almost as if it was trying to communicate, though I couldn't understand what it meant. The sound was so strange, so alien, that it made my stomach churn. It was the kind of sound you hear in nightmares, the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. The creature took a slow step forward, and my body reacted before my mind did. I grabbed my pack, fumbling with it in a panic, pulling out the first thing I could, my flashlight. I shined it at the creature, trying to make sense of what was happening. The light hit it, and for a split second I thought it would flinch or retreat, but it didn't. It just stood there, its red eyes glowing even brighter in the beam of light. I felt my chest tighten. Jason finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." I didn't need any more convincing. Without thinking, we both grabbed our gear, shoving everything into our backpacks as fast as we could. My hands were shaking, and my breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. The creature didn't move. It just watched us, its gaze never leaving us, as we scrambled to pack and get out of there. I didn't care about anything at that moment, only the overwhelming need to escape. We didn't say a word to each other, didn't need to. We both knew that if we stayed, we might not get out alive. We turned and ran, stumbling through the rocky desert terrain, our feet slipping on the loose ground, our hearts pounding in our chests. I could hear Jason's heavy breathing beside me, but I didn't dare look back. Every instinct screamed at me to keep running, to put as much distance between us and whatever that thing was. I could still feel its gaze on my back, burning into me, even though I was running as fast as I could. We didn't stop. Not when we hit the edge of the forest, not when we stumbled down a small hill. We just kept running, fueled by nothing but pure, raw fear. The further we went, the more my mind tried to make sense of what had just happened. But no explanation seemed to fit. There was nothing in my knowledge of the wilderness or the creatures that lived there that could explain that thing we had seen. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a coyote, it wasn't anything that should exist. It was something otherworldly, something that didn't belong in this world. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached the nearest town. Our legs were sore, our bodies drenched in sweat, and our minds were racing. I don't know how long it took to get there, but it felt like hours. The first place we saw was a small gas station, lit up by the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. We stumbled inside, nearly collapsing at the counter. The clerk behind the register looked up at us, eyes wide, but we didn't care. We didn't say anything, just breathing heavily, still trying to catch our breath. When we finally regained some composure, Jason and I exchanged a look, the realization dawning on both of us. Neither of us spoke about what we'd seen. Not to the clerk, not to anyone. What could we say? Who would believe us? We didn't know what it was, and we didn't want to know. After that night, we never spoke of it again. The fear, the memories, the images of those glowing red eyes, they all stayed with me. I still don't know what it was we encountered out there in the desert, but I know one thing for sure. Some things in the wild aren't meant to be understood. Some things are better left in the darkness. And no matter how much I want to forget, I'll never be able to shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. Even now, whenever I go back into the wilderness, I can't help but feel those eyes on me again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I had been looking forward to getting away from everything. Work, the noise of the city, and the constant buzz of daily life. I had been searching for a spot far from people, somewhere secluded, and when I found this campsite in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, it seemed like the perfect place to unplug and reset. The trees were towering, ancient, their trunks thick and gnarled, with the smell of moss and damp earth hanging in the cool air. The quiet was almost too much, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I arrived around dusk, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the high canopy of pines. It was early enough to get the fire going and set up camp without feeling rushed. The sounds of birds and small critters scurrying through the underbrush were comforting at first. I set up my tent and laid out my gear. My small fire crackled in front of me, casting dancing shadows across the forest floor, but soon, the shadows swallowed everything beyond the campfire's reach. As night descended, I sat by the fire, listening to the sound of the forest settling in around me, the occasional rustling of leaves, the distant croak of a frog, the chirp of crickets, nothing out of the ordinary. I had grown accustomed to the quiet solitude of the wilderness, and it didn't take long for me to start relaxing. I unwrapped a granola bar, letting the peacefulness sink into my bones, until the shadows between the trees deepened and stretched with the last bit of light. Around midnight, that's when I first heard it. A soft rustling, like whispers drifting through the trees. I thought it was the wind at first, the kind of wind that shifts the branches in subtle ways. But then, the rustling took on a different quality. More deliberate, almost as if someone was moving through the forest, deliberately trying to stay out of sight. It wasn't the random, unpredictable rustle of wind or an animal's footsteps. No, these whispers felt purposeful. I tensed. Maybe it was someone else out here, just as lost in the woods as I was. But the thought of another camper this deep in the forest seemed unlikely. Still, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than the wind playing tricks. I stood up from my seat and shone my flashlight into the dark. The beam sliced through the night, illuminating the trees around my campsite. Nothing, just dark trunks, twisted roots, and shadows, all of it frozen under the weight of silence. I was starting to feel a little foolish for getting anxious. It was probably an animal, maybe even a deer or a raccoon sneaking through the brush. I sat back down, telling myself to calm down. It wasn't a big deal. I reminded myself that I had camped alone before, and the woods always had their way of making the ordinary seem strange at night. The fire crackled louder now, and the shadows danced wildly. Then I heard it again. The whispers had grown louder, and now I could make out more distinct sounds, like voices. Not loud, not close, but still too clear to be ignored. The forest around me felt alive, the whispers circling, as though the trees themselves were talking. My skin prickled. This was no ordinary wind. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The voices weren't just whispers anymore. They were growing closer, moving around me, coming from all directions. I felt my heart race. I didn't know why I felt so uneasy, but I did. And the feeling was deep in my gut, like something wasn't right. I grabbed my flashlight again, this time swinging it over the area around my campsite. The beam shot through the dark, but once again, I saw nothing but shadows and trees. Still, the voices continued, soft, low, and indistinct. I stood up, my breathing quickening. It didn't make sense. Who would be out here this deep in the forest at this hour? And why did it feel like the forest itself was watching me? Just as I was about to dismiss the strange sensation, I heard something else. A soft, high-pitched laugh, barely a sound above the wind, but unmistakable. A child's laugh. I froze. There was no child out here. I was miles from any town with no sign of anyone for miles around. Yet that laugh, so clear, so eerie, rang out again, coming from somewhere in the distance. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint where it had come from. A child's laughter, deep in the woods. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a sound echoing from somewhere far off. But my instincts were screaming at me now. No, this was wrong. I had been out here long enough to know when something wasn't right. I picked up my gear quickly, shoving it into my pack. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved, trying not to let the rising panic take over. My thoughts were scattered. I needed to leave. I had to leave. The whispering and the laughing. Something about it made my skin crawl. I unzipped the tent, grabbed my pack, and threw it over my shoulder. I was already moving before I even fully processed what I was doing. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground was somehow pulling at me. I could still hear the whispers in the distance, faint but persistent. The laughter, too, was still there, distant but echoing through the trees. I didn't stop to look around. I didn't need to see what was out there. The presence of something, someone, was enough. I could feel it like an oppressive weight pressing down on me, urging me to move faster. I tried to keep calm, telling myself it was nothing, that it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I was halfway to the trail when I heard something else. A thump, a loud crack, like a heavy footstep on the forest floor. It came from behind me, just off to the side, and I spun around, my heart leaping in my throat. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the dark once again, but I saw nothing. No person, no animal, just trees, shadows, and that silence, like the forest was holding its breath. But I didn't stay to investigate. My feet were already moving, faster now, the whispers still following me. I reached the trailhead and nearly stumbled over my own feet in my hurry to get out. I couldn't tell you what I was so afraid of. There had been no clear signs of danger, no footprints or signs of someone else's presence. But everything felt wrong. The whispers, the laughter, it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. It was the way the forest felt, the way the air shifted, heavy with something that wasn't right. I kept walking, my pace quickening as I put more distance between myself and the camp. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but I couldn't. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. The laughter continued, fainter now, but still there. I tried not to look back. I forced myself to stay focused on the trail, on the sound of my own breath and the crunch of leaves underfoot. When I finally made it back to my truck, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and pulled away from the trailhead. The forest seemed to close in around me, but I didn't look back. Couldn't. In the following days, I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had followed me back to the city. I convinced myself that it was just a combination of exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the forest playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I didn't tell anyone about it. Maybe I should have, but who would believe me? That night, I wasn't just afraid of the whispers or the laughter. I was afraid of what I didn't know, of what I couldn't see, and I was afraid that, one day, I would find myself back in that forest, unable to leave, no matter how hard I tried.